Hello, I'm Eric Meyer. I'm a developer advocate at Igalia.
I am Brian Kardell. I am also a developer advocate at Igalia, and today we have a special guest. Would you like to introduce yourself?
G'day. My name's Alex Moore, and I run the not-for-profit advocacy group called Open Web Advocacy.
Yeah, and we thought we would have Alex on because we've been talking about like web ecosystem health for a lot of years. We have a whole playlist on this that you can listen to. We started in 2019, and basically all of the funding for the web comes from Google default search deals. And something will come along and interrupt it. And then what? OWA is involved in tackling several problems like that. Do you want to kind of introduce some of the things that you've been involved with and tackling for?
Sure. So really, OWA is primarily about ensuring that the web remains open, accessible, and a competitive platform for innovation in general. And our primary focus has been giving users and developers the ability to access, create, and distribute web applications that can operate on an equal footing with native apps across all the various platforms. And just to give a bit of background, if we talk about the web on desktop, we can consider it a huge success. Like if you think about desktop, over 70% of all usage on desktop is either within a browser tab or it's an application powered by browser technology. Whereas if you look at the mobile web, so the latest statistic we have from the UK is that users only spend 16% of the time in a browser. And if you limit that to what you consider app-like experiences, it's going to be significantly less than that. And the reason OW came along is that we needed to address this issue, and really the failure of the mobile web has many causes, but the predominant one is anti-competitive behavior from Apple, particularly around their browser engine ban, which has then led on to an underinvestment in Safari and a lack of competitive pressure on iOS. Really, the easiest way to understand that is on iOS, there's no threat that users are going to start fleeing to other browsers because all the browsers are essentially the same. And then because there's no threat of losing users, that leads to an underinvestment, which leads to a huge amount of bugs and stability issues that make web apps less viable, and critical missing features like install prompts and proper notification support. And then you've got Google, on the other hand, who's then paying Apple $20 billion per year for the search engine default, not only for searches in Safari, but also inside Chrome on iOS. So they're paying for both, which is really bizarre, but then also might explain why the reason Google hasn't historically fought very hard to get their real browser onto iOS, because they already got what they wanted, which is search engine dominance. Behind all of that, for our ecosystem to work properly, we really need heavy competition between browsers, especially competition that sort of motivates them to spend big on platform. And that's where we came along. Is what we're trying to do is get fair and effective competition between all browser platforms. Because in the case where you have competing browsers where they can customize the functionality that's delivered to users and developers, that competition is still important. In fact, probably I suspect that the privacy changes that Google's been like with Privacy Sandbox and stuff like that is a reaction to the progress made in browsers like Safari. So that even the and to the other Chromium-based browsers, because if Google doesn't compete, even though they're using the same engine, if they don't compete with those features, then they're likely to lose market share to the other browsers. Where you're talking about browser engine competition, the competition is for for what you consider sort of new features and functionality. That the competition only matters on the leading edge.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of the things. Like, I want us to have an open, competitive web and everything. I just think that the trouble is that we are in this like deeply interconnected thing of multiple antitrust lawsuits from, Apple and Google and Meta and Amazon, and we have to figure out how to unwind this. And I worry about what could happen if we pull on the wrong string and we lose our sweater, right? Like that's. So the topic that we have, the thing that brought us here is actually it's a Google suit. And actually it's one of 5 suits that have been brought against Google since 2020. So there's been a lot against Google recently. Do you want to like break down what this one was about?
Sure. So the DOJ case, which is United States versus Google, it's a federal antitrust case that's been going on for about 4 years. It was started under the previous Trump administration, and it's under Judge Amit Mehta. Now, the DOJ argued that Google violated the Sherman Antitrust Act by illegally monopolizing the search engine market. And the core thrust of the argument was that Google engaged in a series of behaviors and deals that prevent any other search engine from being able to effectively enter the market. Now, what happened recently in August is the DOJ won the case against Google. And so now we're moving on to a new stage, which is the remedies stage, where the DOJ has to put forward remedies, which they have, and then the judge is going to rule on those remedies.
And then after all of that, there will be appeals and appeals and appeals, and it will probably, very likely, wind up before the Supreme Court at some point.
Probably, yeah. Last night, the DOJ outlined their proposed remedies, but it's probably worth talking about what the remedies they asked for.
Yeah, absolutely. That's
just to give you, I'll just quickly skim over the remedies they asked for, and there's a lot of them, so I'll go through quickly, but it was prohibiting and cancelling the Apple-Google search deal, eliminating placement deals for Chrome on Android, requiring Google to divest Chrome and block re-entry into the browser market for 10 years, prohibiting Google from paying any browser for default placement for their search, banning Google from sharing revenue with any browsers, removing the bundling requirements, like bundling Chrome in Android's Matter agreements, that's their agreements with mobile devices for both Google Search and Chrome, implementing choice screens for Android, which cover both browsers and search engines. Then if the Android remedies fail, Google has to divest itself of Android, including the Google Play Store, and Google must not use any Google-owned asset to self-preference Google search engine, search, text ads, or AI products, and there's an extensive list of what exactly that means. And Google must share its search index to qualified competitors at a reasonable cost, including any data from Google properties such as YouTube, which uses Google's own search index. And Google is not allowed to invest in any search access point or AI product that is a potential entrance into the Google search or search text ads as a potential competitor. And so that's pretty much the summary of all of the main proposed remedies.
So is the Department of Justice recommending that literally all of these things be done, or are they laying out a menu of options to say to the judge, you could pick some, one or some or all of these?
Well, they're asking for all of these. Oh, now I just realized, sorry, I've got another 10 on my list. So I'm sorry, let me continue on because some of these are important.
Sure.
So enforcing remedies that prevent Google from using its other products to self-preference search or text ads, allowing qualified competitors to simulate queries, provide competitors at no cost all ads data, provide any qualified competitor to syndicate Google search at marginal cost, allow any competitor at marginal cost syndicated search text ads for 1 year, provide all advertisers the individual ad level for the preceding 18 months showing the metrics necessary for the advertiser to evaluate its ad performance, and prohibiting Google from pre-installing Google Search or Chrome on its own devices. So, I mean, that's a big list of asks. And lots of these remedies we think are great. I mean, it's just a couple of them that we're concerned could have very bad, unintended negative consequences for the web.
Yeah, sorry, I thought you were done with the list before. That's why I asked.
No.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It's a lot.
Like sort of my instinctive reaction is, okay, they're prohibiting Google from paying for default search deals, but that doesn't prohibit anyone else.
No, it doesn't.
So that would seem to create a vacuum into which, I don't know who, but somebody could step in to say, we know Google used to pay you a lot of money. We maybe can't pay you that much money, but we can still pay you money to be the default search on, on Firefox or on Safari or whatever. Does the Department of Justice, have they said to Congress, you should probably just outlaw these in general? Or is it literally just Google did these things, we're going to bring the hammer down on Google, we're not thinking about anything else right now?
They're asking the judge for these remedies,
right?
The judge has sort of fairly broad powers to implement all of those listed, including both the behavioral remedies and the structural remedies. And the whole idea with this is that we don't have a competitive search market in general now, which could have a lot of effects. For example, pushing up the costs of advertising for people to sell their products, as well as lowering the quality of the search engine. Because if there's more competition of search, then you'd hope that it would also improve the quality of search. Maybe you get less ads or more actual content. The two things we're most concerned about out of all the remedies.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
So one of them was the total ban of revenue sharing for setting Google as the default search engine. Now, if you think of what this would mean, is that there's a number of browsers that have search engine deals with Google, in particular Mozilla. And if all of the search engine deals gets banned in a fell swoop, then that will leave Mozilla without its primary revenue source, and a number of the smaller other browsers will be deeply affected. And the second one is obviously also very concerning. It's the forced sale of Chrome, which we think has a huge number of unintended consequences and would likely be a disaster if it goes ahead and it's under the current proposal.
Why do you think that would be disastrous? Not that I disagree with you.
So the DOJ's proposed Google sells Chrome, which raises a lot of important questions. So the first one would be, who's going to buy it? And once the buyer buys it, what's their revenue source going to be? Because the proposed remedies also prohibit any search deal with Google, including partial agreements. And then so you've got to think, well, what's the financial viability of Chrome under those conditions? Now, one of the primary concerns we have is we're worried about the possibility of Chrome being acquired by an entity that doesn't value the open web or the web platform, or even worse, is actively opposed to it. The other concern would be, would the owner continue funneling the necessary investment into Chrome, into maintaining and advancing the platform?
Chromium here, you mean?
Yeah, Chrome and Chromium, yes. But for both, I think it's both important.
I mean, I don't doubt that they would continue to invest in Chrome in the same way that Opera invests in Opera and Microsoft invests in Edge. And it's much, much cheaper to do that. And it is the part that the user touches. So there's good incentive to want it to be a good experience. It's the stuff, as you say, underneath, that is the underlying stuff that's really expensive to maintain. And there's a bit of this that I think that you're alluding to, that you and I have discussed in the past as well, which is that not only is Google sort of the main source of all of this funding, but they also have for at least a decade played the role of the R&D arm of the web platform. So, whatever you think Mozilla pays currently for Firefox, whatever you think, Apple pays, Google pays like an order of magnitude more.
Do you have an estimate as to how much investment that would be on an annual basis for, let's say that, Omnicorp buys Chrome? If they were to keep up the same level of investment, what would they need to be putting in every year? Do we have a guess as to what that is?
So Brian's probably got some guesses as well, but our guess is we think Google currently has about 1,000 developers on the browser and about 1,000 on platform, and platform being the APIs and technology that's used to run websites and web apps.
That would include, though, not just people actually doing the development. It would include like managers, QA people doing like CI infrastructure,
Yeah, although it wouldn't include a lot of the security teams got moved externally. So there's a significant number of security personnel which are involved in Chrome and Chromium security stuff, which would be external to that. So if you think about 2,000 developers and an average cost of $500,000 each, once you include their wage, taxes, benefits, equity, building costs, their desk, etc., then you're talking about around $1 billion per year for just staffing, plus an extra few hundred outside of that organization. And then you have to talk about all of their all of the equipment they need, all their server infrastructure, which would be quite significant, and the fact that they rely on a lot of other Google departments which they don't currently have to run. So, like legal teams, marketing, HR teams, the infrastructure teams, which they're not having to foot the bill for at the moment. The other, so that's just cost. Once you sell that to a separate entity, you have this, let's call it somewhere between 1.5 and $3 billion cost per year. You have to think that the entity has just spent a significant amount of money buying Chrome, and they have to recoup their investment, and they know in 10 years' time, Google's going to come back onto the block and be able to start shipping their own browser again. And you have to think, what's the incentive of that organization to continue to invest in platform? How is investing in platform going to help them recoup their 15, 20, $25 billion investment in purchasing Chrome? And the answer is that's not obvious. Whereas, if they got in and they just gutted the whole platform team, then they could significantly reduce the ongoing costs while probably not having any short-term effect on their user base. And that's how really the sort of potential disaster scenario is. And there's other disaster scenarios as well. Like, how are they going to recoup money from Chrome if they're not signing a search engine deal with Google? Is there enough money from the other search engines, like so from Bing and DuckDuckGo and Ecosia? Because you got to realize Google's not allowed to bid for that default placement, which means there's going to be less pressure on the other parties to bid as high, which will reduce the potential revenue further.
So a couple of things. One, like you also didn't include in there, the people who work on standards, the DevRels, of which there are many and very high quality, all of the things that they do for the platform, like teaching people about the web platform, and all of the web platform test infrastructure actually is Google infrastructure. So that also uses a lot of like Google Cloud services. It's building these browsers all the time. It's running this, it's storing all this data indefinitely. So yeah, there's it would be pretty huge and costly to do. And yeah, for me, this is the concern, is that there isn't a business model. Like, this is the thing I have been, saying, like, that's the thing that we really need to tackle. We need to figure out like how to make a business model. But what's interesting to me is, like, when you break this down and you look at like the different antitrust things that are brought here, like, it's not so much like about some of these other things. It's about search dominance and ad tech and advertising, that seems like the very most basic direct thing that's in there is like the ability to share the index. I think that sounds to me like a really important one, because the cost of developing an index like that is astronomical, and sort of like the bigger it gets, the better it gets. And so it's very difficult, as the other engines have said, to kind of compete with that. And like, as to whether or not like these other engines could play the same role, I think kind of why though? Like, why would they? Because, one of the things that has worried me a lot, I'm very much on board with the antitrust actions. I worry that we do them poorly, we interrupt the wrong thing, like, I think that you just have to be very careful how you do them, or else, the monopoly reconstitutes itself in a better way or something, like you waste a lot of dollars trying to make a shift and ultimately you don't. This is kind of like the one chance to do something. And there are historically good things that came from antitrust, even for shareholders, like, directly. So I'm all on board with that. I think you have to worry about how it plays out. One of the things that definitely I've seen some data on and some studies is that a lot of times antitrust actions have the result of mainly handing a lot of business to whoever was second place and not as much actual competition beyond that as we would like. And so in all of these things, you see like Bing keeps coming up. That's like the next biggest. And, Microsoft is a for-profit business. If I was Microsoft and Firefox came to me and said, hey, Google has given us this much money and they can't anymore, can you match what Google? I mean, I would say no, you have them over a barrel, right? Like, yeah.
It's not going to be the same, especially without the competitive pressure of
Yeah.
Google have to compete for those dollars.
Yeah. So I worry that part isn't like I worry that it won't do the thing that you want it to do. So I do kind of agree with you that I think somehow you need to, I don't know, not just throw a grenade at it and go like, now it's good, like, because the thing that to me is different about this than all the other antitrust, except for maybe the one that involved Internet Explorer, the thing that's different to me about this one is that, like, all of those other ones deal with something that is directly itself for profit, and this one is doing that, right? Like, it wants to target ads. Like, it's about ads and search. It's not about web engines. But will it do collateral damage by creating a thing where there is no business model allowed? Now, maybe it's possible that it's failure of imagination on our part. Maybe, I don't know, there is somebody out there who's like, hey, I can do it. Like, I don't know how,
That's
but
very unlikely, because you just think of the motivations between any group or any group of entities purchasing Chrome. I mean, probably if you think of any organization, Microsoft would probably have the closest aligned goals with the open web, considering how much they're spending on developing web apps with it on like the Windows platform. But if you look at Microsoft's behavior in terms of anti-competitive conduct with Edge, it's not going to be a good look for the judge to allow a sale to Microsoft, especially after we only just got out of the noughties IE6 days and all of those issues. And then if you look at all the other major companies, I mean, okay, obviously Apple wants to protect its native app ecosystem. You have Amazon, which is an aggregator for all the merchants, and there's a lot of antitrust issues surrounding them. It starts being hard to think of an organization which has the long-term best interests of the web at heart, which means that if this gets sold to some sort of private equity group, they're most likely just going to engage in very drastic cost-cutting measures, including reducing staff to the minimum, terminating teams working on web platform, and just maintaining a skeleton crew for bug fixes and security updates.
Which is counter then to the goals that we're trying to achieve on all of these things.
And it will cause immense harm to the US economy as well, because if you think of the resulting stagnation, because Google does the majority of all R&D for the web, including all the stuff that ends up in Gecko and WebKit. And the resulting stagnation on that could last for decades. Because if we suddenly remove all of that funding, nobody's doing the work, it's not obvious anyone that we'd see an uptick from other companies doing the work. And all the businesses that then rely on a thriving and a continuously evolving web would be harmed. And then it also starts shifting power away from the web to the alternatives, which is the native app ecosystem,
exactly,
which are in the hands of tech giants.
Which also have their own antitrust.
It almost seems like the only entities that would qualify would be nation states or other large, like the European Union, would be able to spend the money and would hypothetically have nonprofit motive reasons to continue to invest in the thing that they bought. But I have trouble envisioning the European Union saying, sure, we'll buy Chrome for $50 billion and then we'll put $3 billion a year into it.
Yeah, I agree. That's very unlikely. I mean, one of the ideas that was floated before was separating Chrome into a non-profit organization. And that could have avoided the major risks of Chrome being acquired by a Czech giant or private equity. But that is not on the cards at the moment. And even if it was on the cards, there'd be a whole list of conditions that would need to meet to be viable, like a substantial financial war chest and a reliable and significant source of ongoing funding.
So the judge can do that in terms of like giving them a substantial war chest. I mean, the judge can say like, you need to provide what we calculate as funding for the next 5 years or for the next 10 years or, like that's within the purview of the judge.
But that's not what the DOJ is asking for at the moment. And so it's unlikely that the judge by himself will suddenly decide, I think it should be a non-profit, unless the DOJ is requesting it get split out as a non-profit.
Yeah, I mean, a non-profit is only part of the picture anyway. Like, you still need a way to fund it, right? So like Eric was saying, like maybe a nation state could buy it. It seems very unlikely that a U.S. judge is going to say like you should sell it to a nation state. Like if that even happened, then there would, I'm sure, be a completely different legal action that would kick in, saying that immediately that they have to sell it again because like we have also the TikTok thing here, which is a whole nother thing. The trouble is that you need a funding model, and so currently the only one that we have is default search. But not really, though, right? Like, I mean, Google pays money for default search, but what it pays is actually, 36% of the profit from searches that actually happen, right? So I don't believe that there is a thing suggesting that Google can't pay for search. They can't pay for default placement, right?
No, the DOJ prohibits any form of revenue sharing whatsoever.
Is what they're asking for. One of the things they're asking for. Excuse me. Okay.
Yeah, one of the big list. So there are alternatives.
Well, they may not. I have judged.
There is alternatives that could work. So, for example, one that was raised by a group of academics, including Fiona Scott Morton, was that Google is allowed to make search deals, but those search deals have to be capped at 50%. So which means you are allowed to sell 50% of your default to Google, and then the remaining 50% is open to the other competitors. And then that would still...
But that's about default search.
That's for default search, yes.
Yeah, but I'm saying you could just not sell default search, because this is another thing that came up in the court itself is that I think everybody kind of agrees that if we added a choice screen to everything, it wouldn't move the needle much. People are still going to choose Google.
Yeah.
And so, like, this came up is that, like, wouldn't it be ironic if you took $20 billion away from Apple?
Right.
But all the traffic still went to Google, right? Like that's exactly the thing that I'm talking about, that I'm like, no, I mean, I feel like we have to, that one is really obvious. I don't think that I'm remotely the only one who sees that, but it is, exactly the kind of, stepping on the rake kind of comic moment that could happen from these things. So like I was saying, you don't have to pay for default search. You could just let search engines pay anybody who sends stuff there. So like
you'd have to have a motivation for them to pay for that traffic, though. In the case where I don't pay, what is the effect on my incoming traffic? Because the reason they pay for default search at them, they're paying the revenue sharing in return for being the default search engine, because they know being the default means users are going to use Google. And I agree with you that the search engine choice screens won't have as big an effect, but but setting the defaults to 50% most certainly would have a big effect, because one day 50% of your users wake up and their default is now Bing. A large percentage of those users will just continue to use Bing, because that's what's been shown time and time again with when you impose defaults on people.
I mean, when the defaults are good and when they're not disorienting, there are lots of things that we can point to with data that back up that point, but with nuance, right? Like there's definitely nuance that, like, let's talk about the Internet Explorer one, because I have recently even looked up a study that looked at that shows that, like, those choice screens that we spent all that time getting, they didn't really have that much of an effect. Most of the effect kind of would have happened anyway, because Internet Explorer got really bad.
So I think there's a couple of points there. Apparently, they did have quite a significant effect. I think there was stuff from Mozilla which said that they received quite a large number of users from those choice screens. But I think the other aspect of them is, if you actually go look at the choice screens, they are terrible. They have the worst UI, and we're talking both the Windows one and the Android one. The design for both of them, I mean, if we sat down in a room and looked at those designs, it's quite obvious that they weren't going to be effective. If you look at, say, the Windows one, what would happen is it would do a pop-up inside an Internet Explorer window, which would quite often be overlaid by something else that would open later, which you could just close immediately. So it's a pop-up saying, would you like to install another browser, is basically all it was. And then you could click on then and then go down the step, it would basically take you to the website and you could install another browser.
Yeah, you could, they made it so you have to download it and everything, right? So
Whereas,
which is a thing that's hard to get around. Like, you can't pre-install these browsers, right? Like, that's not a thing you can do.
No, but the design that we have now on iOS in the EU is very different. It's not perfect because of limits in the legislation, but basically, when you open Safari for the first time, you get an unskippable browser choice selection of browsers, and then whatever browser you select, you do a one tap, and then that will go download the browser, and that will become your new default browser. And there's had lots of people pour over it, lots of different companies, and it's now at the point where it's actually quite an effective design. The Android one, by comparison, was terrible. It was designed by Google and had a big cancel button down the bottom, which we call the choose Chrome option. And if you think about a user, if they've got a choice screen pop up and there's just a skip, I don't want to deal with this, they're always going to choose that option, which will just favor the gatekeeper.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of difficulty in a choice screen for these things. I'm not saying it can't be done. I think it's probably a really positive thing. but it's only part of the problem, right? Like it's not going to have a big initial shift. Firefox didn't get a sudden incredible influx of users. In fact, their users have continued to fall since 2009.
Yeah, the choice screen is just one small aspect of competition. It's
Yeah.
basically to remove the power of default and the advantage that the gatekeepers give themselves by being the default, which means they then have to fight to get users to choose their browser, either by going to download it or selecting it on the choice screen. It's not going to change the landscape overnight. It's just going to apply additional pressure. So it has to be a small part of a much bigger, comprehensive competition strategy.
Yeah. And this is an interesting thing because it's like, the challenging thing about this, when you do these court actions, there are ways that the US can like charge a group of companies with something more complex. And maybe that might have worked better in my mind because you could act more. But this is kind of an action that you're taking like against Google that is really affecting a lot of other companies here, right? So like Apple will lose $20 billion a year, which is like, we all go, well, yeah, Apple, but that's not small potatoes. And I've said this before, but I think if you lose $20 billion and in the way that corporations work today, you have a duty to shareholders are going to be angry about that. And then it's anybody's guess to me what happens over a while with that. Maybe, as you were saying, it's another one of those things that leads them to go, yeah, maybe this web thing isn't the way. Maybe native is more the way. Maybe why are we even bothering with two things that are competing with one another? One that we can't actually make the money at, or maybe, sure, a lot of people speculate they'll make a search engine. Maybe.
I think Apple has other reasons to continue to invest in their browser because by comparison, especially by, say, Google standards, they're not actually investing that much in their browser and their browser engine. But I think they'll be very reluctant to suddenly lose all of their market share on iOS and essentially hand over control over such an important gateway to users to other vendors. And if once we have real browser engine competition on iOS, if they do stop investing, then over time you would see their market share atrophy. So that even if they lose that $20 billion from Google, I can't see them significantly decreasing their investment in Safari.
So let me ask you a question. Let's rewind to, I want to say like 2017. Somewhere around there, and we go back in time, and I say like, that like Microsoft Edge HTML they've been working on. Everybody's excited about. Microsoft's throwing all this money into it. Like Microsoft was one of the OG champions of the web, right? Like I mean,
Yeah.
If I asked you what are the likelihood you'd see of Microsoft just walking away from having an engine and conceding, well, it's Google and we'll just put a skin on top of it and do a little bit here and there? Like, do you think that you would have prognosticated that would happen or no?
No, well, I can tell you I didn't at the time. I thought it would continue. I was quite surprised when they switched over. I mean,
I worry you would be surprised again.
Quite possibly. At the moment, though, Safari's effect on the ecosystem matters when they're trying to compete with the rest of the ecosystem. While they're not competing, they're under no pressure to deliver features and functionality, or significantly less pressure to deliver features and functionality for developers. So if in the case where they're not really competing outside of Apple's platforms, so if you think of Safari, they compete on macOS. They actually compete on macOS because there's other browsers there. They don't compete on iOS because they don't let anyone ship their own browser, and they don't compete on Android and they don't compete on Windows. So until we get to this situation where they're worried about losing users to other browser vendors because they're not matching in functionality, we're not going to get that intense competition that's actually going to deliver for developers.
How would you feel if it ended the same way for Safari? Like if Safari just became another Chromium. In the process, we lose Firefox the same way. So it's just, there's only one Uber open source project.
Browser engine competition is important. And one of the key reasons it's important is because let's say you have one browser engine pushes ahead in a particular area, be it performance or battery life, to the point it's significantly better than the other browser engines, then that gives a good reason for the other browser engine to rewrite that entire code base. So let's say WebKit came out tomorrow and they're twice as good as battery life as Chromium. Then maybe the Chromium engineers have to go, oh, maybe we need to rewrite the stuff for it to be competitive. In the case where they are all Chromium, then there might be more of a, well, it's good enough. We don't need to rewrite that bit. It's working. And I think that's the real power of browser engine competition, is that pushing ahead in one particular area then pushes the other engines to then have to start competing in that area. In the case where you have, where they're not competitive, and if they're not competitive in performance or privacy or security or battery life or any of the aspects, then the competition is not as important, because they're not, the competition isn't delivering for users and developers. And I think in one aspect, Apple has delivered for users, and that's obviously in the whole sort of privacy area. I feel like because Apple has pushed ahead in that, then that's obviously, affected the entire market. And then you see other browser vendors actually pushing ahead in privacy as well. So it's not just in the platform features, it's also in the browser features. Now, there was one I did want to talk about, back onto our earlier topic. Be worth chatting about what's actually inside Chromium, because there's a lot of stuff in there that...
Do you want to talk about like Skia and things like that?
Yeah, well, I've got a huge list. One of the concerns we have is if the DOJ sells off Chrome along with Chromium and they end up gutting the team, Chromium's enormous, and there's a lot of projects within Chromium that people might not be aware of that actually support other areas of the web ecosystem. The biggest high-profile one is the engine Blink. But there's other things like, say, V8, which is also widely used on servers everywhere now. And obviously, Google is funding the majority of the investment into V8. But that's used for Node.js. It's used for Deno. And it's used in quite a lot of high-profile websites in the US. Then if we talk about graphics libraries, there's... Skia, which is used by Mozilla and used in a bunch of native apps as well. It's probably not obvious to the DOJ that this could then affect all these other organizations as well. And even things like the entire the web's networking infrastructure. If you start talking about HTTP2 and HTTP3 and all of the certificate transparency and certificate management, originally all started under Google. WebRTC, which we're using right now to do this podcast, which you use in Zoom and Teams. Again, it's done via Teams within Google. If you think about codecs, sort of AV1 and VP8, VP9, and Opus, and all of that, they are teams within Google. Lots of the security stuff around sandboxing and fuzzers and that research for browsers happens within the Chromium team.
Even Chromium is itself, what you need to build it is excessive.
Yes.
I think another thing that, I don't mean to cut your list short, but it's a long list. We can we can accept it's a long list. But I think one of the things that is going to be really interesting about this is if you did break it out, if you broke out Chromium, like we need to develop new kinds of governance, new kinds of ways to prioritize the money, that today are just, you do what the people at Google say to do. That's, they have their own internal policies about why they prioritize the things that they do, but those are, driven by certain priorities, and if somebody else were to control it, that's going to change. If we come up, especially with some kind of like, more than one organization funding it, that would get complicated.
I feel like the main issue though is the two core issues has to be the amount of funding is one, and then the motivation to use that funding to invest in platform, and they're the two really difficult issues to solve. I feel like if issues with governance and prioritization and those sort of issues could be worked through, but without the multi-billion-dollar funding source, then those sort of arguments and discussions become moot. I think Google themselves would like more people to contribute to Chromium, and there's
definitely
an effort recently under I think it was under the Linux Foundation that they.
It's not been formally announced yet, but it was talked about in BlinkOn. Yeah.
Okay. There was some other funding for.
I mean, there's Meyer things here and there. Like I believe that there was like some like security funding that went there. We have done things, I believe, with grants from NISO, National Institute of Standards Organizations, through the Sloan Foundation, and APS Physics funded us doing work in Chromium on MathML.
Oh yeah.
And then Pearson also, I believe, contributed some money, and some people actually, like 2 people, gave like $150,000 toward that effort.
No, the other important thing though is obviously we want more people to develop features and functionality for the web and to invest in Chromium and contribute more. But the grunt work, which is the security patches, making sure all the bugs are fixed, still need to be done. If those start getting gutted, then that will reduce the ability of other people to invest in new features. So if you look at what the work Microsoft's doing at the moment, where they've done stuff around multi-window support and WebView 2 and the Web Install API, it's not as obvious if they had to then step in and fix core bugs, whether they would have the same capacity to actually work on, get those engineers to work on new features instead. Yeah. But I think in general, if we could push towards a future where there are more parties, that's really important. And I think that's one of the great things about Igalia, is that does allow people without the engineering expertise to actually contribute by paying for a particular feature.
I would like to keep it into perspective though, because like there are, Google has already partners with big money, right? Samsung, Microsoft, Intel, Red Hat. I mean, I think there are a lot of companies that invest in Chromium, and to not put too fine a point on it, somewhere around like 1% is what the whole rest of the world does. So like it's great. Like we do a lot of work through, companies like Bloomberg has been especially great on a lot of things, funding all kinds of things in JavaScript that have really helped, and funding all kinds of things in CSS that have really helped.
CSS Grid was Bloomberg.
Mm-hmm. CSS Grid was Bloomberg, funded in 2 different engines.
And that's an amazing success story. But yeah, as a percentage, you're saying it's still very, very low.
Yeah, it's still very, very low. And that's why I believe that we need to have this, why I have believed for years that we should have this conversation, because, the solution is in a way right there in front of us, right? Like if we wanted, we could have fixed this problem by massively diversifying Chromium investment and figuring out like a governance model that would work in a system that was not so dominantly Chrome. So if you were to rewind to maybe the second or third thing we did on Web Ecosystem Health, we had Rick Byers from Google on with Rawson from Microsoft. And, Rawson said, well, how do we improve the governance? Like now that Microsoft is involved, like we should have more, seat at the table. And Rick said, well, we think that, that comes with you putting increasing stake into the game and owning more of the thing. Right. So I think shortly after that, I think that Microsoft almost did the inverse, like almost
reduced.
Walked away more for a while, as they seem to have finally come back. But
yeah, I suppose the question is, there is a bit of a tragedy of the commons when it comes to the web, in that somebody else is spending the money, so I don't need to.
Yes.
And the question is, how do you get away from that? And I think that's from third-party companies who heavily rely on the web, not contributing back to the platform, and also some of the browser vendors as well, who profit significantly off of the web, but then also don't heavily contribute back to platform. So, but given the situation we're in now, it's quite hard to see how we would migrate to a system where
very
contributing.
I think we have to wrap up, but I would just add here that there is a great book by Tim Wu called The Master Switch. And he also has another book. I want to say it's called The Curse of Bigness. It's related, and it also, that one does get into some of the stuff with like Google and Apple and, big companies of today. Tim Wu is also kind of like the one who coined and popularized the term net neutrality. He's played a lot of different roles in all this, but there's a lot of history in his books. And, they're fascinating to see what was done in all of these things that dealt with the control of information, kind of, right? And all these sort of empires that were about somehow big business and control of something really important. But the one thing that seems consistent in all this is that, generally speaking, when there's antitrust action, there is a period where there's some kind of blowback toward the consumer, where there's a loss in quality. There's, the market has to figure out how it survives. And I suppose what we're worried about is maybe it doesn't, or maybe it greatly stagnates and slowly decays,
Yeah. And I suppose that's why I'd like to sort of reach out to anyone listening to this podcast, that if you work for a various company with any sort of influence, that we'd actually encourage them to reach out and engage with the DOJ to highlight these risks, and with the certain proposed remedies, such as jeopardizing the smaller browsers or drastically reducing funding to the web. It's really unfortunate that it's largely flown under the radar, because many of the companies that rely on the web weren't directly involved in the case. And so if they didn't have search engine operations or search deals, they weren't engaged with the DOJ. But it's crucial now, we're at this point, that the companies then sort of think about what the ramifications of this is going to be, and consider what the impact is going to be on their business. And to their credit, the DOJ is listening to a lot of parties, including us, but it would be really good for them to hear from other voices, and to hear what are the kind of impacts their actions could have on the wider US economy.
So how would they reach out to DOJ to share their thoughts and concerns?
Well, obviously, any company of a decent size will have a legal team and would have the appropriate contacts. But I suppose what we'd ask is raise these issues within your own organization, and sort of alert management to the risks to the business of what these remedies could cause, and then get your organization to get in contact with the DOJ to submit supporting information about what the long-term effects will have. And obviously, if you are an organization that doesn't have those contacts, then you can always get in contact with us at contact us at openwebadvocacy.org, and we'll help point you in the right direction, because this is a pivotal issue for the web. And if it goes the wrong way, it could drastically decrease funding for the next decade. And that will then flow on to all the other aspects that we're trying to fight for: browser competition, the competition between web apps and native apps, and even just general features and functionality for the web that everybody relies on.
But we all want to fix it.
We all want to fix it, yes.
We all agree on that part. Like we all want to make the web more competitive. We want there to be diversity of engines and funding sources, and I think everybody agrees with that.
And also protect the thing that makes the web great, which is that anybody can just create a website and get that direct, person-to-person connection or business-to-person connection without having to rely on intermediaries or gatekeepers. And that's a really special property of the web, which just is not available anywhere else.
Okay. I think we're just about out of time. So thanks, Alex, for coming on. And
thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you both. Very interesting chat.